Well, good morning. Thank you for joining us today for kind of part 2 of this role of stormwater inland planning. Glad that many of you were able to join us today. And if you didn't join us yesterday, we'll give a quick overview before we dive into the content today. But before we do so, just wanted to make introductions of the folks here. I am Bao Chung Tua with the Mile High Flood District.
They didn't hear, I don't think they.
Can you guys hear us? Okay, sounds like sound is working for some of you. Thank you for letting us know.
Great. Hi, everybody. I'm Brent Caslon with Valerian.
I'm Ryan Taylor with Moeller Engineering Company.
Mary Powell with the Mile High Flood District, Environmental Manager.
Everybody, Jesse Clark with Stream Landscape Architecture and Planning.
Morning, Troy Thompson with Ecological Resource Consultants.
And we do have a lot of folks on today. And so if you can keep your camera off and mute off, but we do want this to be an interactive session. So if you've got any questions or any comments or just, any additional things, pointers that you want to make, don't hesitate to drop your thoughts in the chat. And we are monitoring those very closely and we'll draw those out for conversation. Wanted just to say, kind of transitioning from the video of the 1965 flood and also what we experienced in 2018, this situation is something that many of us encounter during a simple sunny day and then cloudy days, summer thunderstorm, where we stop and we go, how deep is that? How does it look like it's moving very fast? I think I can go. And as you can see in the next 2 slides, so many of us do try to track that. And these, and you can see in that next one too, whether it's small or large call, we do make the call to cross this. These were actual incidences that took place last spring when we had so much rainfall, kind of in the May and June timeframe. Some of these events like this, very simple road overtopping, resulted in road closures for months. One of them actually did result in a death in unincorporated Arapahoe County. And so as you go to the next slide, you'll see that the scariest thing with floods and flood hazards are those that you can't see. There is a channel here. You just can't see it because it's all piped. And the scariest part is when you do notice that there's a hazard, it's almost too late. And this area experienced another death in 2018 because of this invisible hazard. And that's why all of you have joined us today, and many of you have been with us for 2 days. That's what we do really as servants to our community, is to protecting them against floods like what we just observed, while also protecting, the environment. And so what you heard from us yesterday is we wanted to understand how scenes like this come to being. And Jess Clark talked about how the concentration of people moves into an area, and by creating habitat out of the area, we change the natural environment to more of a built environment. Jess talked through different scenarios of the built environment, all the way from kind of a rural community to an urban core community. You also heard this team of experts talk through, well, how does that natural environment respond to this change? And then we also began to explore ways to mitigate that. And we're going to talk more about that today. So what we hope for you to learn today with our learning objective on this next slide is that we hope that you're going to walk away with a little bit better understanding of the principles behind stream management corridors. We talked about what it is yesterday. We're going to talk a little bit more about the principles of stream management corridors. We're also going to talk with this next slide on just providing a high-level overview of how you go about defining stream management corridor. But most importantly, with this next slide, you're going to hear Brent and the rest of this team talk about why it's so important to define not only the stream network, but the stream corridor early, even before you ever start the site plan and plat process. And with that, we're going to go through a little high-level refresher on kind of why we are talking about this type of change with Mary Powell. I'll let you take it over.
Thanks, Val. We touched on this yesterday, but I think it's worth a little bit of a review. Next slide, please, Derek. And that, if you'll recall, the impetus for change was trying to move from reactionary, maybe we've already have some of our infrastructure in place, or we certainly have planned for things that have not left much room for the stream. And so we ended up really needing to focus on the flood control and reducing risk, because those corridors that we had established back in the day were really quite narrow, overly narrow. So we were very focused on moving that water out of the system from point A to point B. And we really focused on those hydrology and hydraulics solutions, which tended to be hardened, as we see here in this instance. So what we're hoping, again, to get out of today's and yesterday's presentations, next slide, please, is to try to start early on. Look at the system that you're working with. And again, as Bao just said, early in the planning process, when you're just looking at the landscape itself, not a blank piece of paper. Remember, I think we don't want to have that mindset that when we're starting to look at an area to do planning, it isn't a blank piece of paper. There's a landscape that you're starting with. So understanding the system that you're looking at, looking at the complexity of the network of stream systems that are there, and being able to plan around that proactively and think ahead to what needs to happen to manage that system. And you'll hear it again, we do this through the means of the high functioning, lower maintenance streams, and the 5 elements that we'll touch on a little bit later today. In your head, try to remind yourself what the 5 elements are. There's 1, 2. Hopefully you went through and you said community values, hydrology, hydraulics, vegetation, and geomorphology. Next slide. So I'm going to bounce it over to Jesse here, please.
All right. Some of this will be a little bit of a review with some different descriptions, but go ahead. One more, sorry. The Ken Burns effect. There you go. Nice. So again, thank you for the reminder. Again, we just wanted to reiterate that the idea here is that the density of humans, urbanization, that's why we're managing our streams. Go ahead. And go ahead, Derek. Next one. Thanks. And we showed this yesterday. But again, reiterating this definition that I sort of cobbled together this definition of urbanization in order to capture the idea in association with urban infrastructure and more in particular, drainage infrastructure. And it's again, that gradual increase in the proportion of people living in an area and in the ways that society adapts to the change. And so again, from the left side, we're kind of that natural unused area. And we're adapting as we move closer to more density, more infrastructure, more framework. Next one. So I love this image, also put together by Andres Duani's office, but it takes the idea of that transect and it puts it a little more into a perspectival image, as well as the plan on the lower half of this. But the reason that I like it is because as we're starting to think about how drainage infrastructure changes as we urbanize, you can really start to see it happen from the way that we get water from, in our case, especially the mountains, all the way down into our waterways that eventually end up in the plains. And the important message here is that we tend to adapt our surroundings to account for that density. Go ahead to the next one, Derek. But often we're adapting our stream systems to the context, rarely the other way around. And that's something that we're really trying to get ahead of here. And what the district's trying to get ahead of is trying to think about how we can be adapting our context to work closely with our stream systems so that we don't have to do as much modification to the stream system. Next slide. And so the ways that we do that, we change things like sinuosity, grade, and cross-section, so the channel itself. And so quickly, some of you may or may not be familiar with some of these terms, but sinuosity simply describes how curvy is the channel. And then the grade is how steep is the channel. And the cross section is how much area is there in that cross section? Is it this really channelized cross section like you see on the right, or is it a paved cross section in the middle, or is it actually going through a pipe? And then there's also more naturalized options, obviously. So we're looking at how we change the channel. We use structures. The further we get in that T4, 5, and 6, we start to see more gutters, gulches, pipes, and certainly the vegetation starts to disappear. We impact the species that we use. We start to see more weeds often, and there's less hydrologic connection. So the natural connection from the water in the ground to the vegetation that's supporting our riparian channels. Go to the next one. So when you take this, and pardon the crudeness of the water being overlaid on these images, but when you take these images, what you can start to see is naturally on the left, you have all of these small order streams that are feeding and combining and coming together and ultimately ending up in a body of water, whether it be a lake or a pond or a larger river system. But as you start to move to the right in these more urban areas, you start to see a more linear pattern. You start to see concentrated flows much more frequently, and you see a larger flow having to be accommodated even in areas like our streets. And so you start to see those major point sources of our waterways where storm systems discharge into the streams or into our rivers directly. Next slide. And so on the left of that transect, we have a lot of space. We have the opportunity to have a much nicer, all of these, by the way, are constructed waterways or waterway improvements. So on the left, you have lots of space. You can see that we've got, room to move laterally. You've got pretty nice connection from the hydrology into the vegetation. When you get into that middle kind of T3, T4 area, you might have some space, but you might need a little bit of grade control. It's a little bit straighter form in the channel, but again, you've got enough of that form and cross section left to support more natural vegetation. Whereas when you get on the right-hand side, you start to see much more vertical grade control walls, large structures for discharging the water, et cetera. Next one, Darren. And so it really gets to that second part of that urban definition, which is the ways in which we adapt to this change. And I just keep showing these images because this is really what we're trying to get away from. And the only way that we can get away from doing this is by thinking ahead and really planning for having enough space to be able to do things that look a little bit more like those images that were on the left and in the middle, where we can be a little more adaptive to the natural conditions. Next one, Jared. And so I call it the 3 S's. The 3 S's are structural, straightened, and standardized. And it seems to be a way that we tend to manage our waterways and our stormwater. The more urban, the more municipal. We have often sort of written our way into these standards that aren't necessarily flexible enough to give us the ability to adapt. And so this approach can be really, it can really result in a lot of expedited flows, as we talked about, less perviousness, which just concentrates our flows and makes velocities higher, more powerful flows, et cetera. And it even results in higher pollutant levels and lower water quality. So we're really starting to look at how these kinds of things impact our context, the areas that we live in, but also in making important impacts to our watershed, flood hazard, stream conditions, et cetera. So we're going to dig a little bit into watershed changes. I think flood hazard and natural stream conditions are probably a little more intuitive. So that's the next part that we'll dig into here.
So I'll go through some watershed changes, and some of this is just going to be refresher. So if you go to the next slide, Derek, I showed these 2 images yesterday about when you're going from sort of this natural environment to an urbanized condition or urban environment. And we talked about how When you do that and you're increasing your impervious areas, your runoff goes up, your peak and flow goes up, and then your velocities and the energy of the water through your system go up as well. Your infiltration goes down, your evapotranspiration goes down, and you get less of that groundwater flow and recharge. So if you go to the next one, this just as a reminder is this dendritic approach that we talked about yesterday. Like I said, imagine that it's a leaf and you've got the main stem or the central part of the leaf as your stream corridor, and you've got all these fingers that, are coming out into the watershed. And it's really those fingers that we're looking at, today, and how do we preserve those in a manner that, helps to reduce the downstream impacts to the stream corridor and preserve a lot of the natural conditions. So if we go to the next one, this is the same project that I had shared yesterday, but what we wanted to go through today was talking a little bit more in depth about strategies. And Brent is going to get into a lot of the planning aspects of this, and like Bao mentioned, of really trying to think through these items early in the process, even before you've got your lot lines, your plat, things like that. So as we talked about, utilizing the stream corridors as a resource, one of the things that I found is that, especially in urban areas, the streams and the areas that seem to be in better shape, less polluted, less trash, things like that, are areas that are utilizing the space as a resource, as an amenity. Areas that, are maybe disconnected from the general population or the city center, oftentimes get left behind and get degraded over time. So really focusing on using it as a resource. Reduce the flow rates and the volumes like we've talked about. Utilizing those natural flow patterns to define your open space network and your stream corridor. And then prioritizing the layout of the site in a way that reduces those downstream impacts. Troy is going to go through more of the stream corridor details today, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. And then lastly is distributing that detention. And one thing I wanted to point out here is that I use this example, one, because it's a really easy site that's currently in development that, just going through Google Earth, you can see the transition from 2015 to today of how the site is being developed. But I want to make it, really clear that these approaches and these strategies can be used in urban environments as well. And so if we go to the next slide, we've got.
Can I touch on one quick thing, Brian?
Yeah, go ahead.
On the slide before, just a reminder to those that were with us yesterday, when what Ryan is referring to watershed change, I want you to keep in mind that without doing anything, the amount of water that your stream is experiencing with those more frequent rainfall events can increase up to 50 times. Just want you to keep in mind.
Yeah.
And for the flood hazard events, those that cause a property or life safety issue goes up twice. So if you're not doing anything, that's what your stream is experiencing pre and kind of post this change. Just wanted to draw that out.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And so, think about that also as we're looking at these urban environments. And so these are just a series of, images that we have showing sort of a typical urban intersection here where it's not a natural condition like we've been talking about, but, and I'm going to make Derek work today. If we go, through here, this is during a rain event. You can see where the drainage is going based off those flow arrows. You've got a lot of the precipitation coming down. You've got some of it being collected on rooftops or on the tops of trucks. So you've got a little bit of your depression storage. We do have some trees. The more vegetation you can provide in an urban center, the benefits are numerous. You get that evapotranspiration, you get some infiltration depending on how you're using the vegetation. You're getting depression storage. You're also helping with the heat island effect, by having that vegetation, it's cooling things down, providing shade. So if you go back 2 slides, Derek, and we think about these strategies from that urban condition, your stream corridor may not be the South Platte River or South New England Gulch or, something like that, but maybe there's a possibility to reestablish a stream corridor, take something out of a pipe and reestablish that natural stream corridor within that urban setting. Again, reducing those rates through vegetated areas, tree canopy, things like that. The natural flow patterns, trying to get away from always putting water into a pipe. Can we use bioretention facilities or, connected green infrastructure facilities to slow the water down before it gets to the stream corridor? So just wanted to make that point there of it's not just these greenfield sites where this is possible. These same strategies can be applied in an urban setting. They need to be a little bit more creative, but you can still do them.
So I'm just going to summarize what I heard you say, Ryan, which I think is such a great important point, especially for those urban core, that T5, T6, is that really what you're trying to do is mimic those natural drainage patterns
Exactly.
from that natural landscape in that urban core, and it's no longer a gulch, a grassline gulch, or a swell.
Right.
It is basically, that's where your tree canopy is. That's where your green infrastructure might be. That now becomes the backbone of really your stream network.
Exactly. Yeah, and this is where when we look at that leaf again, those fingers that spread out, for instance, the South Platte River, the main waterway through thanks Derek, through Denver, those fingers that come out are sort of the roadways and the areas where we can start to introduce these green infrastructure facilities and still provide those benefits like you're saying, Val. The last slide that I have, and then I'll let Brent jump into the role of planning. But another thing to keep in mind is one thing that I always think about on projects is how is this going to look in a dry condition and a wet condition? Because there are benefits to both. In the dry condition, again, you're getting the tree canopy, the shade, things like that. But then in the wet condition, you're getting that functionality of where you can maybe start in an urban setting, combining facilities together or, maximizing that green infrastructure capabilities.
So obviously, there's a role for planners. So Derek, you go to the next slide. And it's not just, site planners. We're talking about regional transportation planners, long-range planners. But for this presentation, kind of as we go forward, we're focusing on the site plan, but that doesn't mean that a lot of this stuff can't be extrapolated to a regional or a comprehensive plan ideas, master plan ideas. So in the next slide, and if you keep going, Derek, it's just kind of a running thing. So the role of planners is, to guide the development process. So and then obviously we're trying to predict the future, and then also allocating space. So how do we do that? If you go to the next slide. So we obviously, predict the future with data, understanding population trends, science, art, and then a little bit of wiggle room is what I like to say. So if you go, keep clicking, Derek. And that's what we like to call, resilience. So on the next slide, resilience is really kind of built into a lot of the sites that we're building now. So the red lines here, signify the property lines. And then the blue line down the middle is the stream. If you click one more time, Derek, and this shaded blue would be the floodplain. What we're trying to do is build in resilience, build in that wiggle room. And I would say that this project did a really good job of doing that, especially on that left side. Now, the question is the right side on the stream management corridor, is it enough? And I think that's why we have Troy on our team here to help us try to figure that out from a geomorphics standpoint, but then also, Ryan here from an H&H standpoint, from hydraulics and hydrology, to see if, what we're doing is the right thing. Maybe our team would be there to make sure that the people can move through this corridor in an effective way. I think that this park is a pretty good example of how you can use the space kind of comprehensively for all of the components that we're trying to talk about.
Can I add something here, Brent?
Sure.
I just wanted to recognize, this is, for those of you, I'm sure that many of you recognize, this is First Creek at Tower Road in the city and county of Denver. And I do really want to give credit because this is actually space that was set aside as a part of the subdivision planning process when this was being developed, set aside really in credit to the Denver Parks, Denver planners, working very closely with the developers to say, hey, as you're going through your planning process, please set aside this space. And they did. I mean, this space was made available for the community because of that partnership and relationship between the developer and the city and county of Denver. And without that conversation, this would not have happened because this project actually took place after the subdivision had been fully built out, and it would not have been possible to have reclaimed the space had it not been set aside. So I just want to give credit to the city and county of Denver and the Green Valley Ranch developer that made this happen.
Mhm. Very good points. So if you go to the next slide, just kind of some general questions to try to, spur some thought. But how does each municipality go from comprehensive plan goals, strategies, to the development process, to the site development process? Is there a connection with that? And then, as the municipalities, change their comprehensive plan, change their master plan, does the development code change at the same time? I know that sometimes that lags. And so some of those comprehensive plan goals aren't always reflected in the development code. So, and that's just, the process. But, and again, every municipality does it different. You'll hear me say that a lot. But so it's just something to think about is, we can develop these goals of creating great stream management corridors, but how do we make that happen on a site plan level project? So from a regional scale all the way down to a site plan scale. So if you go to the next slide. So now we're going to start kind of going through the development process and really kind of how it works. So again, the planner is really kind of guiding this process. So Derek, you can just keep clicking and it's going to take us through. So generally the development process is kind of going through, if you go to the next slide. Okay, so we start off, the developer does a pro forma and we can just keep going, Derek. And that would then, allow the team to do a density study. So trying to figure out how many lots you can get on a site, kind of working with your parameters with the municipality rules and just starting that quick layout of, this is how many lots I can get. Let's make sure that, the money works. Then we move on. The next slide is, the development consultants kind of unite and say, let's do this together. And sometimes that happens, and I'd say a lot more often now that happens. Sometimes it was kind of done in a silo. So, one group would be working on it without the help of the multidisciplinary team that we were kind of talking about. So if you go to the next slide. The developer, says, let's do it. We can, once we get the plan kind of all set, we can do it. Let's do the pre-application next week, right? Let's go for it. Let's get this thing moving. And then next slide. And then that starts that conceptual plan process. If you keep going, Derek. And but it's not fully engineered, right? Not saying that we've fallen off the tracks yet, but we are going through the process and kind of starting to lay out our site with all the parameters that we need to have. So if you go into the next slide, we'll talk about the plat, where it's a balancing act, right? We're trying to make the space for, and I'll use the example of a residential community, but the lots versus the open space versus stream corridors and roads, and just making sure that we get it all right. But how do we know that we're getting everything right for the streams? So if you go to the next slide, Derek. It's space allocation again. But again, what about the rest? Sometimes the plan is done at the same time as the plat. Sometimes the plat is done first. So do we do concurrent submittals where the plan and the plat are really kind of talking to each other and making sure, if we go to the next slide, that we have everything good. That's our plan. All the stuff is good. We're done. We've got everything that we need in the right spots. So if you go to the next slide. And once that's all approved, the planner kind of steps out of the room at that point. We're done. We've now moved that project onto the engineering folks where they are now going to be moving towards building permits. And if you go, but not so fast. So we still have a lot of engineering to do on these projects. And if you go to the next slide. And we'll just make sure that we make it work, right? We have to make it work within what we have. So keep going. And then we add our final engineering. But what happens if we need a change that's already approved? A change in those plans that's on that finally approved to the plat and plan. If you go to the next, we've already done our density study. This is where we've kind of figured out where everything needs to go. And if you go to the next slide. So we're really trying to figure out how to get our project, the certainties that are desired in our project. The developer wants to know what can I do, what I can't do. And they're looking at a municipality to help them do that. The municipality is looking for protections that are for the good of the public interest. And then we have public and private elements. What about stormwater considerations? What about the stream network, the detention and the stream management corridors? We'll also have standards that need to be achieved through architecture, but the ultimate goal is that highest and best use.
And Ben, you might touch on this later, and if you do, you can tell me to hold off on my question, my thought process. But knowing that these certainties are desired, if you go back to the process slide, maybe it's the one right before, Derek, I just wanted to pick your brain, Brent, when you're looking at this. I mean, that performa market analysis phase seems so important because that really is where numbers are being, dollars, basically saying this project needs to only cost this. We've got revenue and expenditures and profit margins. That decision's being made very early in the process. So if you want some desired outcome or certainty, there are certain decisions that probably need to be made at the bubble diagram, that bubble steady phase, which is occurring at this pro forma phase. Are you also saying, Brent, that from a stream network and stream corridor that really Troy and Ryan touched on yesterday, that you need to somewhat have that sketched out at this phase ahead of, again, plat and site plan?
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's exactly where I'm getting is having all the right people at that initial density study, that site layout, and using those team members to really create something, again, that's special, but then also making sure that we are covered for later on. From a market, like a pro forma standpoint, you could get all the way to building permits and things will explode at that point. You've gone through so much of the work as far as the planning work, the engineering, and initial engineering, and there's a lot of money in just doing that, and so I think it's a good thing to bring all of those people in at the beginning. And I'm not saying that doesn't happen on every project, but I think that it could happen more, and it could be a little bit more just that multidisciplinary team. And I'm guessing that a lot of these projects aren't necessarily bringing a geomorphologist on a project at a pro forma stage.
Yeah, I'd say that from the flood district, and I don't want to speak too much for my local government colleagues that's out in the audience or out in the industry, but a lot of times we are brought in pretty much between plan, but probably closer to building permit. And I think that's where a lot of the tension occurs is we are brought in and then all they hear us say is more space, which basically takes the process right back to the beginning. And that we completely appreciate and respect how painful that is. And that's part of why we're having the conversation today is engage with us early in the phase when you're looking at a site, so that we can have the conversation on space. And it's not, I would just want to be upfront. It's not us trying to grab as much land as we possibly can. But as Jess and Mary spoke to, it's really us thinking about things through the lens of the 5 elements and creating that push and pull.
Yeah, I was just gonna add, I think we've been seeing a lot of, the projects are coming out of a planning process that's happened in some cases 10+ years ago. And so some of this is, what we're trying to do is get ahead, right? We're trying to stop some of the challenges that we're having that you just described, Val, from happening in the future. So a lot of times it's budget related, we're working on budgets that were developed several years ago. Many of these are occurring in, call them even comprehensive plans, vision plans, these special district plans, redevelopment things that are happening. We're working on a project right now where the development plan identified essentially the least amount necessary to get the water through, to get the floodplain reconciled. And then when we start to layer all of these things back in, everyone starts to realize, oh, we don't have enough space, we don't have enough money. And so now we're having to backtrack a lot of different things based on decisions that were made, in a very early, this was way before even a market analysis and pro forma. This was simply just saying, this is what we want to do with these kinds of spaces or this kind of redevelopment. So I think the message here is get ahead of that way before you think you need to, because you're going to end up spending more money, spending more time. You're often going to change the development product. In this case, what you're talking about here is, oh, we think we're going to end up with this development product. Therefore, we're going to be able to sell it. Therefore, our pro forma works out. Then you get into it and you realize we can't actually develop that product, or we can't develop as many of that product. And so it changes everything. So that's the message that I have.
Right, and sometimes a loss of, 2 or 3 lots may make the pro forma not work anymore. It may,
Absolutely.
that, and that's.
Well, they're not even lots. I mean, think
Right.
multifamily, mixed use.
Right,
It's not just lots.
It's not lots.
It's not just single family,
right.
or
It could be parking.
it could be
Right.
parking, it could be parks. It could, all of these things, the space needs to be there.
Right. Yeah, no, and a loss of any of that could, like you said, derail the project, if you will. So Derek, if we go 2 slides, I think ahead. There you
We're
go.
making Derek work today.
Thank
you, Derek.
But, as well, flexibilities are desired by the developer. They want to know what their building envelopes, their setbacks are going to be. And the municipality is looking again for those protections. But then, what happens with these changes after approval? And how do we prepare for a need that we don't see coming? You already said it, Jess. It was, a lot of these things were planned 10 years ago. And 10 years ago, we were doing things different than we do now already. Like the way that we are doing a lot of these stream corridors and doing a lot of this work, it's changed. And I think it's going to keep morphing. We just need to make sure that we are allocating the right amount of space.
I will say, Brent, we're in a market condition right now, working with my developer friends, is that the product that they were trying to push a few years ago is now changing. And so the need to go back and revisit the site plan and plat is real. And so I think there are certain flexibilities and I would say not even flexibility, that as local governments or public entities that we probably need to be agile too.
Yeah.
Because the market conditions moving forward are probably going to be more volatile than they were looking past.
Right, absolutely. And I think, if everybody thinks about these projects as a team mentality, right? Where everybody's on the same team rather than kind of an animosity, us versus them, a lot of things can happen. So I guess I would recommend everybody kind of get on the same page early on in that pre-app condition, but then also, how can everybody help each other? Because, everybody's busy. Everybody is going through a lot of it. So I think that if we can focus and become more of a team mentality, better things can happen. So takeaways from the role of planning. Planners allocate space. Again, all municipalities are doing it different. And if you click them some more, there you go. The major details seem to wait until the end of the process to get figured out. Stormwater system, pipes, your phase 3 drainage studies. A lot of that stuff happens as you're applying for building permits. Are we getting to where we need to be early enough in the process to make sure that we've allocated enough space? Comprehensive plan versus site plan. Are we really using the comp plan as intended in our site planning? Are regional considerations accounted for in our site plans? That's, again, making sure that we're allocating the space for our streams as well as our roadways, as well as our trails and open space. Just making sure that we're all working in concert. And in order to get this done, sometimes it takes policy changes, which take a long time. I think that that's the other thing too, is a lot of these projects have been, they started planning 10, 15 years ago. And, they're kind of using somewhat old rules, somewhat new rules. And so there's just always there's always something changing with it all. And so then, talking about teams, that multidisciplinary team is going to, I think, help everybody out from the private side to the public side, whether you're a viewer or you're a designer, having a robust team of experts on your side is and knowing who to call is kind of half the battle. So.
I just want to recognize something you said yesterday, Brent, and I just want to remind that the planner, whether you are on the city or county side, or whether you are on the private side, I will say the more that I've come to know my planner friends, you are the gatekeepers to the diversity of the project team. You are the key to the success of that multifunction component of the project. And so that's why I think that you conveyed the title of really a champion on a project, because the planners do that. They're the one key member or key team that sees the holistic aspect of the project. A lot of times the stormwater are just working in their swim lane and just focus on the stormwater piece, but they don't realize the burden that they're causing park and open space, or the burden that they're causing the lotting, but the planner understands that. And so I just want to emphasize that I, with Brent, do recognize the planners as really key to the success of a multidiscipline, multi-benefit project, because you do have that more holistic look on the project, and your ability to shape the team, your ability to get your client on board with the necessity of a multidiscipline team is going to be key to the certainty that I think you spoke to, Brent, but also the flexibility that's also desired as you kind of go through this land development process, whether it's on the public sector or on the private sector side. I'd love to, Brent, add thoughts to that, but anyone else at the table that just wants to add thoughts to that, because it's so important in terms of recognizing the planners in that role.
Well, and any planner that, I always say we're a jack of all trades. And so kind of knowing a little bit of each part of the 5 elements is I think critical. And again, that's just kind of how I guess I've always thought of a planner kind of functioning as that multi-disciplinary person, not a master of any of them necessarily, but knows who to call when they need to have something more I guess studied on each side or in.
And I'll just add from, the engineering standpoint is I've been on various projects where, we come in sort of late in the game and we're told, okay, you have 100 feet basically to design this channel and get it through there. And oftentimes what that means is we're designing steeper systems that require more, hard structures, riprap, grouted boulder structures, things like that, whereas if maybe we had been at the table earlier on in the planning process, we could have identified areas where okay, this area makes sense to have it a little bit steeper. But this area here, if we could really take advantage of the space, then, you could maybe integrate additional amenities and community benefits. And I know Troy will get into that a lot more, but, defining that overall width, it's really hard from an engineering perspective not to just do a trapezoidal channel when you're only given a limited amount of space, to put something in.
I like to frame this a little bit in terms of risk. This is, when you're making these kinds of decisions, and of course, there's always a level of risk consideration when you're thinking of how we're going to evolve our urban areas, whether it's going to be a new development or redevelopment, whether we're making space for parks, any of those things. What we're really thinking about is, on the most conservative side, take as much space as you possibly can, and then be able to, when you're actually designing and implementing, be able to tighten the belt, right? That's a level of risk that some people aren't willing to take because it means that their pro forma might not work out. And so on the other end, the risk is neck it down as far as you can, start with a tight belt. But when you start with a tight belt, it's much harder to get it back. And so I look at it kind of like, if you're 2 points on the continuum, more conservative, most risk. Working with a solid team, you can really help yourself or help your team identify where should we be on the continuum of risk, because that investment on the front end in making space will reflect where how much work you're going to have to do on the back end. And so often, to your point, Ryan, I make this point all the time, when you're over in the T4, 5, and 6, you're already constrained. The context has already given you that constraint. So you're never going to get more, or it would take a lot to get more. So I just like to offer that up as a perspective of, it's really about identifying what level of risk you're going to take on, because later on, it's much harder to address.
Right. Absolutely. And I think, sorry.
Oh, no, Please, Brent.
I think there's a give and take as well on each of these sites. If there's a lot of collaboration that can happen to determine, again, that highest and best use for all of our space. And when you have that multidisciplinary team, you can really suss out that give and take, like, where I can be super conservative and where I can, where I don't need to be as well.
And I think you took my words, exactly what I was going to say, Brent, and I love how you framed it, Jess, of risk. And I would say it's not just risk to our streams. When Mary speaks
That's
to
right.
higher functioning, low maintenance streams, it's not just about the stream, it's truly looking at the system, which includes the development project. It's truly doing that risk to performa, risk to streams, risk to community, risk to open space, risk to venture. We're looking at it holistically. It's not just the district going, what do we need for the stream? And let's fight only for the stream. No, it's really about fighting for the project as a whole, the goals of the project, which includes a land development project piece. We're looking risk as it is relative to that. And so when we're talking about higher function, low maintenance streams, I want people to get out of their head. We're not talking about a wide, shallow flowing channel. We're talking about a channel that is appropriate for that context. And in some cases, it might be narrower. Like Ryan said, it might be steeper. In other cases, it might be wider.
Well, and if we can really, efficiently manage those risks within that watershed, within the development itself, you're already benefiting the stream corridor before you even get to the design of the corridor. So, keep that in mind too. A lot of the work and the hydrology piece that we talked about yesterday is even before you get to that stream corridor, you're already providing those benefits if you're including everybody in the room and you're going through this process.
Great point.
One more slide. I have a couple more, kind of overarching
Sorry,
questions. You're fine. I think this is great discussion. So where in the development process does stormwater management stream planning occur? I think we talked about this a little bit, but sometimes it does wait till the end. Sometimes it is a little bit more front and center. And I think it's site to site, but I think what we're trying to say is maybe it does need to be more on that front end, a lot, and mostly on every project. And then who do we need to talk to about the stream needs? How are the needs being taken into account in the development process? as planners, we should understand how the space is allocated for the stormwater systems. And then again, I'm gonna keep going back to that trapezoidal channel that everybody loves so much, but is that really going to serve the purpose in the future? Is that really the best way? Because a lot of times I feel in that pro forma time, the time that we're doing that pro forma work, the conceptual design, I think that's a lot. Is we are trying to push the stream to a point where we can get it done in this. I think we just need to look at can we do better with more. And then I think next we're going to talk about how much space is required for the streams. How do we get to the how? Who do we talk to?
It's a good time for a break.
Yeah, I was gonna say, Laura, is this a good time for a break before Troy dives into probably a very interesting piece of conversation today? Yeah,
Most interesting.
most interesting. Correction.
Some
The
might
the
say.
keynote speaker is about to join us.
So it's a good time for people to ask questions as
Yeah, I
well.
think.
Yeah, so if you've got questions now, or if you want to take a, what, Laura, 10-minute break?
Yeah.
Yeah, 10-minute break, or we'll hang here. If you guys have questions, feel free to turn on your camera and say it, or feel free to drop it in the chat.
There's been lots of good discussion in the chat, just kind of speaking to everybody's role in this whole process and the development process and how to share that and how to contribute.
Yeah, Jared's comment here, I think, is a good one about, in some cases, depending on how the development is structured and sort of who takes over that responsibility once the developer leaves the site, how do you work with that and knowing that the developer is going to walk away at some point, how do you get them invested with the site to make sure that they're providing the best conditions and allocating that space at the planning stage for whoever is going to move in and take over? I think is a great comment and question.
If they only leave a certain amount of space, are they strapping the municipality or maybe the flood district with the maintenance of that stream that wasn't, it was planned in a different way, that doesn't necessarily provide for maintenance in a good way, I guess, right? It's it could create a lot more maintenance.
Yeah, I would say, in our, and this is the flood district, we don't have as much experience or deep bench like many of you, and especially our local government partners, but in some of our interactions, I will say that you're always going to be working with either a landowner and the one that is developing it, whether just taking it through the entitlement process, or you're working with the developer who's actually going to be taking through the entitlement process and the builder. And I would say that there's always a partnership as they're going through it.
That's right.
And even if you're on the back end where you're working with a builder and then now a metro district, there's always partnerships. I would say that there's actually enough connections. There's some check and balance that's in play. And the key to this recipe is, I will say, it's going to be a little bit of all of us, the local government, that partnership, and the flood district. I will say that we've had pretty effective conversation to make sure that not one entity, as you're going through the process of landowner, land developer, horizontal developer, vertical developer, metro district, city, county, and the district. I would say that we've been effective in having those conversations where not one of those entity holds too much of the eggs.
Yeah.
That you're spreading those eggs. You might be picking it up, putting one basket, and then picking it up and putting the next basket. But I think that's the key in having a multidiscipline team, in my opinion, is that you're able to have those conversations on risk as you're going through the process, especially when the landowner drops out and now it's a developer, and now the developer's working with the builder, developer drops out, builder goes away, now you're working with metro district, and then it's a metro district long-term working with the city, county, and the district. But I think that if you structure this right with a multidiscipline team, those tough questions are being asked along the way, and the eggs are putting in the right basket and not one basket's holding too many. That's been my experience thus far. I mean, I'd love to hear from my team here.
Yeah, that's right. I was just going to jump in and say, I think we want to be careful not to vilify the developer. I think we have a tendency to vilify the developer and what they're really doing is following the rules,
Right.
following the plans. That, they're doing what they think they need to do to get to the finish line. And, this is, I think what you just described, Val, this is a team effort here. And it's the point of making a good plan and thinking ahead and really involving a lot of different people is to make sure that we're setting up developers and others for success. And so when we have that vision for success, we have to be able to lay down build a road that is actually achievable. And if we haven't built a road that is achievable, then we're not setting anybody up for success.
Yeah, these pain point comes, and I will want to repeat them again, they come when we have these tenuous conversations or start to vilify certain entities, is because change is coming into the process unexpected and it's
Right.
coming into the process late. And it typically is related, I will say it's typically related to space.
That's right.
Space is the one key change that is the biggest pain point. So what if your color changes on your monument? So what if your structure types go from loose rock to granite boulder? Big deal when you need more right of way. Big deal when you didn't account for that park that you needed. Big deal when that channel needs more space. And so I think that's why we're talking about identify your street network, which is the path of flow of how water moves through your site, the space associated with it, and make sure you're thinking about that as you're developing your site plan, which ultimately results in tracts, parcels, right away, which ultimately results in your plat. I think that's probably the key to minimizing the pain points, as I've come to understand it, working in the development industry for the last decade. And if you are able to have that conversation with a multidisciplinary team, it feels like the rest of it can be details. That's just my opinion.
Lots of good discussion talking about the various team members that need to be present. And also hitting on the timing piece. I think that those are two big takeaways. You want to have the right people at the table and you want to have the conversation early on.
Wonderful. Anything specific that you want to draw out? For those
No
general
specific
themes?
questions, but lots of good conversation talking about this topic. So appreciate you guys all collaborating in the chat.
At the end of the day, I mean, every, consultant that's on the team, whether it's the developer, the consultant team, all of that, we all have a job to do. And we're all just trying to do the best we can, I think. I think I don't think anybody wants to do a bad job. That's not how we want to leave the world.
Right.
Any other questions or comments before we move on?
It hasn't been quite 10 minutes, just
Got 2
FYI.
minutes left.
Any other questions?
We have the time.
We have some breathing room. Make sure you're drinking plenty of water out there.
I think what's happening, some of the comments in the chat are really hitting on an important piece of bringing the developer to the table as well as a team member and making them feel like their objectives are important to the outcome as well.
Worthy, yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
The Jeopardy music right now.
I know. Everybody's really looking forward to Troy talking.
We're ramping up.
They're getting caffeine. That's what
Little
they're doing.
lanes, little lanes.
Caffeine for this.
I'll do a little informal poll while we're waiting. I guess I'm just really interested to know, let's see how to phrase this so you can do
How
the,
many people are still awake?
well, there's that. How, do the thumbs up. Has the material so far been meeting generally what you had expected it would be? Maybe give a thumbs up or, oh, a heart, that's good, okay. Good, okay, that's
That's great.
excellent. What's another way to phrase a thumbs up question to help us? Oh, well, feel free to put into the chat anything that you feel like we haven't touched on much or that you feel like might need another session. We may have some time at the end of today to touch on a few things in more detail. Bao will be sending out, by the way, a poll later today that might get to some of what I'm saying here, which is we love to hear your feedback. And if there are some aspects that we could go into more detail on or less detail, that would be very helpful for next year. I think the intent is to do this somewhat annually in the future. So we're always looking to improve the delivery, et cetera.
Somewhat annually.
Somewhat annually, well,
Don't want to commit too much.
I'm not going to commit
Yeah.
to anything that far ahead. So
Long-term operations
Oh.
and maintenance, that's a good one.
that is a very good one.
I'd say that's a lot of the reason why we're trying to talk to everybody about, higher functioning, lower maintenance streams.
Yeah, no, we could spend obviously 2 days just on that. I think one thing, let's see, how will this, I think we send out, Ray, I think we send out a link to the recording after the meeting is completed. We sent one out for yesterday, is that right?
I'm not sure if the recording has gone out yet. You all
Okay.
should have received PDFs of the slides. And the recordings will come out as well.
Okay, so we'll get you that. Yeah, so I think we're ready to get back. We don't need bow, right?
Everybody can buckle up. Troy's gonna lay it down.
All right,
Pressure.
get your big kid pants on.
Yeah, the easy part, I guess, now we've talked about this need for room, so the really easy part is just defining that, or at least I wish it were that way. You'd go ahead to the next slide. So sort of the starting point, kind of the nomenclature that's being used, at least in some context, is a stream management corridor. And what you're seeing on the graphic there on the left is just some stream management corridors that had been previously evaluated in some of the streams within the district. But essentially what we have here on the right is a definition, and I'll go ahead and read that. So it's the area needed to protect and preserve urban stream corridors while also identifying an overall width that the stream may function or may require to function. So as the definition implies, it's a bit ambiguous. So it's saying we need room, we need to allow things to function, but what all does that mean? And like a lot of things, that depends a bit upon the context you're working in. Next slide, please. So one of the big points we want you to think about in the context of this stream management corridor is what we've been going through here, is that there are a lot of things that need to be considered, and the 5 elements is a perfect example of that. So you can think of, the community values. Is that corridor going to provide you with the room necessary for the community to be able to take advantage of the functions that streams have? We saw a lot of comments today and yesterday in that you've been typing in on how the green spaces, being outdoors, are really things that draw people to a community. And this is a great opportunity to do that. Very much related to that is the vegetation, having a landscape that is something that feels natural, that might be a break from some of the other landscapes when you're away from those corridors, really needs to be considered. The hydrology and hydraulics, the water that's moving, obviously need to be considered, because that's really sort of the center point of what a stream is doing, is moving water, and then geomorphology, the sediment that's moving through the system. So as a context to all of the discussions about how you size a stream management corridor, you really want to keep all of these in mind, because in some instances, the context of how each of these 5 elements are going to come into play are going to be a little bit different. Next slide. You want to make sure everyone is dizzy before.
This is a nice drink your water break.
Dizzy.
Feel free to.
I'm going to jump back to Ryan here for a minute to talk about some space allocation and projects.
Yeah, I've got one example here that I really wanted to share because I think it highlights a couple things. One is, this is more of that urban environment. So it's more of that, T3, T4 case that we're talking about. So this is Harvard Gulch as it runs through Denver. And this is an area where, this neighborhood has been around for a long time. And so when we're talking about space allocation, I think one of the important things, at least, what I'm showing here on the screen is, even though this is a really tight corridor, this park, Robert H. McWilliams Park, is, there was some intention with this space. What we're showing in the green hatch would be the floodway. The blue is sort of that 100-year floodplain. And although, we would love to have more space, for this stream corridor here, the great thing is that there's some intention with the multifunctionality of it. So, in the photo there, looking at the cross section, you can see that it's not only, a space for the channel, but there's a park space, there's, other recreational aspects within this area. It's in the middle of the neighborhood, so it's providing that community access and community benefit. And so, again, even though it's not as much space that we would prefer, being a developed condition, maximizing, what's available to work multiple functions. Conversely, if you go to the next slide, this is also Harvard Gulch, about a mile downstream of the park we just looked at. And, you can see this is one of those examples where, historically the development was allowed to basically encroach on the channel section. And again, the green being the floodway has now been minimized. But the 100-year floodplain is even off the screen here. And so, just another example showing that when we're not allocating that space, what you're ultimately, unfortunately left with is a condition where you're having to use either a concrete line channel with walls, or like this, which are probably 2-to-1, 3-to-1 concrete slopes, just getting the water from point A to point B. So just a quick example of, how space allocation is super important.
Fine. So those two graphics on Harvard Gulch, I think, are great segues into how you do it, because it's really showing why we want to make sure we're evaluating the room that might be necessary for stream corridors. And so with that, what I'm going to do is, at a very high level, walk through 4 different approaches that could be used to evaluate what a stream management corridor would potentially need. In all of these cases, what we're really focusing on is the stream itself. So it's really of the 5 elements, these are considering the hydrology, the hydraulics, the geomorphology, more so than they're considering the other 2. So that's something that, even with the techniques that have been developed, you really want to take a step back and understand how that fits in. So with that, we can jump into the first one. I guess that's right. This might have a toggle through, but if not, no big deal. If go back up, maybe. There we go. If you could toggle down one, let's see how this works. If not, this is just fine. So the first method is based upon shear stress or stream power. And for those of you that maybe aren't as much into the numbers, I apologize for that. But essentially what it is doing is, it's a method that evaluates the width of a stream corridor so that the water that's coming from a high event, typically the 100-year event, the energy in that water is low enough so that you can essentially resist erosion forces. And so the idea is, the wider you make an area, or wider an area you leave, the lower the flow is, the less energy the flow that's carrying. So that is what the concept is for shear stress or stream power. Benefits of that here in the greens, or the pros, it's a really simple calculation. All you really need to have is data on the flows. And again, this is typically looked at with a 100-year event. the topography, so you can figure out what the slopes are through the area, and the vegetation or ground cover, because what the vegetation or ground cover is giving you an idea of is the resistance of resistance to erosion that will factor into how big the area needs to be. It's a very simple calculation. So that's a benefit. There are some cons, unfortunately. One of which, biggest of which really is the equations that are set up for shear stress and stream power rely heavily on the slope of the channel. That's why it's such an easy calculation. You're essentially looking at the slope and a few other factors. And where that becomes a problem in these calculations is you tend to get a underestimation for the room that you would probably require when you have a flatter slope. So flatter slopes, think of drainages that are, let's say, 1% or flatter, and that's just a somewhat arbitrary number. But the flatter you get, you tend to find that the room that is calculated by this method becomes very small. Conversely, if you have an area where you have steep slopes, this calculation method is going to give you a very, very wide area. So applying a shear stress or stream power calculation to estimate the stream management corridor, let's say in the foothills, when you may be on a 4% slope, really could overestimate. You come up with very wide corridors. So you would want to use any of these calculations sort of with a grain of salt, or at least understand the setting you're in so you can help interpret what this result will give you. Another con for this, as I've mentioned, is it's really only looking at, in this case, really two of the elements. There's not much even geomorphology. It's really looking at hydrology and hydraulics and setting a corridor based upon that.
What, real quick, before you move on, for our viewers, what units could they expect to hear when somebody says, what's the shear stress or what's the power, so that when they're looking at something, they know what to be looking for? Because we hear, we deal with this all the time, and it's sort of like, well, where can we expect to be able to grow vegetation, or where can we, and there's a lot more to that, but just for the basics, what is that unit?
Yeah, typically what you're looking at is a unit of a pound per square foot. And so there've been some studies that look at different types of vegetation, or even more engineered, let's say armored facilities that would define a shear stress or a pound per square foot at which you start to lose stability, or you would start to mobilize the bed. And so generally what you're doing, particularly from a shear stress, is you're putting things back to the flow in a pounds per square foot and relating that to the resistance of vegetation or another armoring in pounds per square foot.
And I don't know if this is so simple, too simple, or even incorrect, Troy, but it's almost the way that I imagine it is, you imagine kind of, let's go back to that simple trapezoidal channel, and that's a surface area. And then it's that prism of water, and it's the friction basically between the water prism and that surface area of the channel. I mean, that's what this is measuring.
Yeah, exactly right. And I tried to minimize the friction shear stress. You're all exactly right. That's exactly what it is doing, is
If you could break down the algorithm.
we've got equations coming.
Go ahead and just give us the equation, Troy. I know you want to.
Yeah, but that's exactly what you're looking at, is what is the force exerted by the slope of the land and the water that's being moved through relative to the resistance to that force that comes from the land or the armoring that you're looking at. So definitely a good technique, but one of the techniques. Maybe if you tap forward, there we go. Let's go down now to the next one. See where we end up.
Yes.
Animation, it's not loving the animation, but let's go.
If you, there's some green that should.
Yeah, exactly.
There we go.
It's starting to come in.
There we go.
There's probably one. There we go. All right. Just as we intended it to come in. Beautiful. So this next method is more empirical relationships. And what this is doing is it's looking at some sort of relationships that have been studied a lot by looking at natural stream systems or other stream systems to try to define what a river wants to do. And if you think of a river that might be out in a, let's say, a very shallow slope kind of meadow environment, you can kind of imagine a stream that's going to meander or be real sinuous. Maybe a mountain stream, if you think, would be very different, whereas maybe not quite as sinuous. But the idea is that based upon some of the parameters that would be known, you can come up with what the shape of the stream is that it is going to want to take moving forward. And then the idea is that you take those empirical studies to come up with what you think is an analogous system for the stream that you're looking at evaluating or designing. The pros to that is there really is a lot of information that has been developed that looks at what is the sort of the typical geometry of a stream for different settings. So essentially, if you know things like flows or the bankful width of the channel, the slope of your valley, the types of substrate or the type of rock or that may be in the channel, you can get a pretty good idea of how a natural stream is going to want to behave or what the shape of it is going to be. So those are the pros. The cons of this is most of the equations that are used from these empirical relationships end up relating things back to what's called a bankful width. And you could think of that as just sort of the active channel, the normal area that the water is going to flow in kind of a bigger event. And oftentimes that the bankful width or active channel is unknown. And so what you're forced to do then is you need to estimate what that bankful width is. And then you're taking that estimate and then making another estimate based upon these relationships. And so you start to stack up a lot of uncertainty, which just adds the inaccuracies or uncertainty to the overall result you get. Another challenge with that is because there are different ways you can do it. You could have multiple people be provided with the same problem and give you very different results. If someone had, a desire to have a larger or wider corridor, you certainly could come up with a calculation that would support that. So that's one of the challenges with the empirical relationships. The second bullet there under the cons is oftentimes what we're looking at for developed areas is the flows themselves are changing as the result of increased pervious areas, the things we've talked about today and yesterday. That uncertainty and what flows are going to look like in the future make it even more complicated to define what your bankful width might be, which then impacts what your ultimate channel geometry might be. And as I said, there are a range of many different equations. And so depending upon which equation might be chosen, you can come up with a result that might have a pretty narrow versus a fairly wide stream management corridor by doing these calculations. Then the last item here, we have here that, again, we want to consider all the 5 elements. And what we're looking at here is the hydrology and the hydraulics in sort of a static, a stream that's sort of in one location context for what the results would be. And with that, I've got another slide that sort of explains some of this a little bit more next. So really with this concept, what we're doing is we're trying to figure out the items that are shown in this exhibit. So essentially on the far right, we have this MA, which is the meander amplitude, or sometimes it's called belt width. And what this is doing from these calculations is you're determining how wide a stream may want to be from one side of a meander to the other side of the meander, and saying that is the room that a stream under somewhat natural conditions is going to want to occupy. And that really is the sort of the end result of these calculations. And in most cases, if you see here on the left, there's a value W that's showing the width. That's the width of the active or bankful channel, and almost all of the equations that would define this MA are based upon calculations of W for the bankful width. Next slide, please. Now we go into a third method that could be used, topographic signatures. And what that is what you're basically doing is you're using the topography of a site to give an indicator of the room that a stream has historically occupied. There's multiple different ways to do it, so we kind of lump these under topographic signatures. But things you can think of is some may be used to a relative elevation model. You might think of it as a floodplain model, as the floodplain is sort of extending to an extent that oftentimes is confined based upon what the topography is doing, or even other just direct evaluations of topography. There's some pros of doing this. One is that topography signatures really are good indicators of maximum extent of stream movement, particularly in areas that have not been impacted or developed. And the reason for that is a lot of the topography we have is really generated based upon the movement of water as it deposits and erodes materials. Another thing that is a positive here is that it typically includes room for not just hydrology, hydraulics, or geomorphology, but generally sort of those wider corridors that topography provides does give room in that setting for some of the other elements, vegetation and the human element. Unlike all of the different methods, this also has some challenges. One of which is in a lot of places that we're looking at greenfield developments, there really aren't a lot of signatures, topographic signatures that can be used for this. And think of, let's say, out in the Eastern Plains where a lot of development is occurring in areas that had been agricultural fields. Well, the natural drainages that had existed have probably been plowed under or some way other manipulated by past practices. And so you lose all of those topographic features that could enable you to use this method. Another thing is that topographic signatures, where they do exist, are often dictated either by geology or some large historic flow events. And it's possible that those historic flow events may not be representative of future flow conditions. We've talked a lot about how much flows can change with development. And so that's something that you would at least want to consider with these using this approach is, are the flows that have formed what you're looking at similar to what flows might be in the future? And then the last thing here in the.
Could I just say one thing,
Oh,
Troy?
please.
I think that's such an important point that I learned recently from you, which is it's one thing to also look at the past and saying that might not be representative of the future. But the other thing which you help me to understand is the past might be kind of a geologic event, and in human event or human time frame, it may not be relative, and therefore that signature may or may not be relevant to consider. So it goes both ways. I just
Yeah.
want to draw that out.
No, that's very true. And that's really the last bullet here.
Oh, I'm sorry.
is- No, that sort of is the segue between the two, because the third red bullet or second red bullet talks about flows may change, therefore you could argue that maybe you need more room. The last is that some of the topographic signatures are based upon these geologic events that maybe are, I mean, maybe it's, a 10,000 year storm or some type of debris flows that maybe is well outside of what we should really be asking people to plan for or leave aside.
I think there's an interesting couple of questions in here.
Yeah,
And-
we've got do you want?
Yeah, well, I was just gonna say, why don't you either read it or,
So the question that came in
These are-
is that in the stream slide that shows the ultimate width. So I think if you want to go back a
Ultimate.
few, dear. It looked like there was a zone of erosion along the edge of the furthest width of the stream. Wouldn't the width want to account for a zone of erosion?
Exactly. And that's one of those areas that when you do this calculation will essentially give you this value MA. And then what you need to do is you need to plan for zone of erosion and beyond that, because it's not just the stream. You still outside of that want to have room for, vegetation, the human element. All of those things have to really be added to this, which is why we're looking at, with this, we're looking at specifically the hydrology, hydraulics, and what we call sort of the static geomorphology. It's sort of one snapshot in time of what a stream may do, but you ideally would want to give yourself, more room, some larger ratio outside of this for those things, the stream movement and the other elements.
And I would add that, I mean, this is case in point for context. You know, you might have architectural context, you might have transportation context, and you might even just have landform context. A lot of these situations end up in an overall valley where you might have 50 feet of grade adjacent. And so that space next to it, when you're talking about a cut bank, or you're talking about that outside limit of the belt width, it's also got to take into account, well, what would happen if you had a 4-to-1 grade going for 35 feet? You know, you can't just straight grade a 1-to-1 or a 2-to-1 or even a 3-to-1 through that side bank without there being some pretty severe implications to the context. So this to me is kind of a really important point to make, in that we can't just be thinking about the plan diagram here. It's got to count for all of these other considerations.
And Ryan has a specific project on a development project where there was that situation of a really tall canyon. And guess what? That's the whole reason why they named the development the canyons. It's to preserve some of those really geological but architectural feature. And
Yep.
you want to talk through some of the considerations there from a design standpoint?
Yeah, I was going to actually bring up that exact
Okay.
example because
I'm sorry, I keep jumping.
Yeah,
the gun
no,
with you
you're
guys.
keep setting us up. And you know, Jeff had a good point here where you're not trying to bring that development right up to that cut bank. And in this example that Bao mentioned, it was there's a lot of benefits to keeping those existing banks, you know, not just from a aesthetic point of view, but if you go out there, a lot of these cut banks actually provide habitat, you know, to birds and small mammals and things that actually burrow into those slopes, and including snakes. I've seen several snakes out there that actually use these cut banks for habitat. And you know, so just going through and blowing it all out, you know, you're removing that possibility of having the plants and animals and native species out there. And so what we did from a design standpoint is we actually pulled the channel away from that cut bank, and then evaluating the flow rates, the meanders, things like that, we basically did enough work within the channel to reduce the risk of further erosion on that cut bank, and brought the outside bend high enough to where we could convey that 100-year flow away from that cut bank. So you're still allowing for the aesthetics, the habitat, all of those things to occur at the that cut bank, but we've moved the channel just far enough to provide that space so that we're not creating further erosion, you know, down the road.
There's a couple of follow-up questions. How do you account for the managing of natural flow in a safe fail solution? And how do we define the delineation of what natural is to a development?
Great questions, and there's not a clear-cut answer.
Yeah.
And to me, the biggest part of that answer is having space. Space gives you the opportunity to do whatever maintenance may be required, because none of us are smart enough to get this right, because there's nothing right about a stream. Streams are dynamic features. And so I think the biggest thing is to know places where you have your biggest potential liabilities or biggest risks from, you know, maybe you need to have a hardened point to define where you're calling the edge between natural and developed. But then wherever possible, provide room so that you can let the stream system do what it wants to do. And by that, it's not just the stream, it's the sediment, it's the vegetation, all of that. And, you know, it may be to the benefit of all of this is there isn't, you're probably getting from the discussion, there isn't a one equation you can plug through to say, here is your stream management corridor. It's never that simple. You have to always look at the context. You look at what's happening outside of the stream. You look at, you know, as Ryan's talking about, canyon areas, habitat, natural areas, utilities, all of that has to be factored in. But what we're presenting here with these methods are, at least they're starting points. They're places that you can use to evaluate what is a stream potentially going to want to do, and then when you have to make those judgments, let's say that something's going to be narrower, you understand that you're constricting an area, so you know that you might have some responses that you may need to be ready for. You might plan on more maintenance. You might know that there's going to be the need for more money spent on armoring as you do that. But this hopefully gives you a starting point for the area that you think you're trying to, or the stream itself is going to want to capture.
I think this really just speaks to the idea of the knobs and the levers that you're turning, and again, the importance of including more people in that discussion early on. Because you might determine that, well, we don't need space for something, right? We need more space for something else. So it's really that, back to that.
If I could jump in on the natural piece, and I'd love Mary to speak to the St. Bill. If I had a chocolate, I'd throw it out to whoever answered that question. They were listening yesterday, Mary. I think on the natural, and Troy, please correct any of my statements here because you're the expert in the room, but I just want to emphasize that we are introducing and using natural materials. We might be mimicking natural functions elsewhere in the landscape. What we aren't necessarily trying to do is necessarily force the native condition to stay
Right.
true moving
Right.
forward. There's a difference between what was native there and what's now natural. And I'm going to stop there and let you expand on that if it makes sense to expand on it. I don't know if that's what your question was getting to.
I'll start, but then Mary, you jump in.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, I think we're fooling ourselves if we try to think that we're creating natural streams, because anytime we have the development from whatever it is, the change in flows, just the people that are going to be there to use it, the types of wildlife that are going to use the corridors are impacted from what a natural or pre-developed situation is. I think the idea here is we're trying to take clues from what a natural system would want to do, and knowing that from the stream itself, that if we try to allow a stream to do what it may do in sort of its affected environment, meaning higher flows, changed vegetation, all of that. But if we're considering that and we're still trying to allow room, we at least are not fighting the natural process of the streams. And I think, a lot of that gets back to sort of the idea of the reactionary design that we've done previously, is when we haven't factored in what a stream wants to do, things erode and we end up using a lot of concrete and making straight streams. Here, the idea is we're never going to know it perfectly, but if we follow some of the clues of a natural-like environment in our very much impacted setting, that we're less likely to have a situation where we're fighting what the natural processes are, and therefore, hopefully, we have a system that achieves a lot of the benefits we're looking for from a corridor, and hopefully it's lower maintenance.
Yeah, like he said. I don't have anything to add. That was
That was
perfect.
perfect.
Yeah.
I hope this is recorded.
Yes,
Never again.
2 points for Troy. I've been tracking Troy.
There's been some good
1 hour,
discussion.
46 minutes and 52 seconds, Mary said.
There's been some good discussion just talking about if every project will end up needing engineering or adjustment, or if in some future day, we might have the entire floodplain left intact. And I think you guys talked a lot about that with context, so.
I think it gets back to that, that transect, that idea of the transect, and that is that the more dense you are, you're either having to honor a really wide space, right? I mean, in our case, if you think about systems like Sand Creek, Cherry Creek, the Platte, these are systems that used to have a belt width miles wide. And so you either have to say, okay, we're keeping that belt width a mile wide, or you've got to make adaptations that change it. I mean, that's really what it is.
There's a comment here about sort of the challenges of doing what I'm talking about in sort of the real time of development, and try to get these answers. And honestly, I think all the methods I'm going through are types of things that can be done early on. Essentially, what you need for these calculations is you need topography, which obviously you would have very early on, and you need to understand flows. And so, there could be some uncertainty in flows, but you're looking at some of the low flows, such as the type of flow or flood event that might happen roughly every year, up to the 100-year flow. Once you have that, and then a few other tools that I'll look at in this next method, you really have all the tools to do what I'm talking about here from a very high level planning. And so I do think that this does lend itself reasonably well to things that can be incorporated early on in the process, because these may look like things that, I mean, obviously you can get into very, very much go down rabbit holes in some of these calculations, but you can get a pretty good idea on this with not a lot of base information.
And I just want to add, Troy, to your point there, because I think it's very important for the audience to hear this, is that we're not adding more at the planning phase. We're basically saying we're from a stormwater planning, the stormwater planner's role in kind of that pro forma through site plan phase. There's no need to do a design of the channel. Those hours, that allocation of effort should actually be conveyed to this. Because what's most important in that phase is really understanding the space and doing enough design to basically quantify costs. But you don't need to do the detailed design that I think we're traditionally used to. So this is we've been talking about allocating space, is allocating that effort differently. So it's not more, it's just different.
It often translates into less
Yes,
because of what I was describing earlier, which is if you don't do that on the front end, you end up being reactive.
that's very true. Very true. And feel free to continue on, Troy. We've been
That was
interrupting.
good.
Thanks for letting us hijack.
I love it. This is just a graphic of a relative elevation model, and this doesn't give you a stream management corridor. Essentially, maybe I'll back up. What a relative elevation model is, it's just an assessment of topography. And so what it's doing at any one cross section along the stream, it's giving a different color for how high an area is above the stream bed. So blue being the stream, it's at one elevation, and you step up in elevation, you get into the greens are a bit higher than the blues, or dark blue, light blue, green, yellow, orange. And while this doesn't say what a stream corridor would be, and I honestly, I stole this graphic from the internet, so I don't know what project this is, but I think you can start to look at something like this and say, that maybe what we should be looking at is something that's at least the extent of greens, or greens moving into the darker colors as sort of a starting point. And that's what the elevation of a site would be telling us. And, this is back to the point in time in this, if you have the topography, this is a pretty simple CAD exercise to pull up something like this. Or if you're in an area that has a floodplain, you could use the floodplain as sort of defining those topographic boundaries. And so it's things that can happen relatively quickly in the process. Next slide, please. And so this is the last method that we're presenting, and it's just using reference area. And the idea here is that you may be in a situation where you can define a stream management corridor based upon information from some other areas. The benefit of that is oftentimes if you have an analog site, it's really a good starting point for what a natural system setting might want to do. The cons for this is, one, a lot of sites, particularly areas that are maybe greenfield developments or smaller, like first order streams, may not have very good reference areas that are similar to your project. Also, when you're looking at a reference area, another challenge or thing to consider is that the geometry of a reference area is formed by whatever geology, flow, those things have happened historically. And it's possible that as a site develops, you're changing enough of those that a reference area maybe isn't relevant to your site because of the impacts of development. Next slide. So this is just an example. On the lower left and lower right are just two places that we pulled out some information from this overall graphic. And what we did is we were looking at well, let me back up. Right where it says example in the middle is an area that had been used for agriculture. So the stream that had been there had been highly impacted. And with this site being looked at for development, one thing that a person could do is look at some areas that are upstream. So lower left, lower right in this graphic is some of the geometry that was observed just upstream of the site. And what this was saying is upstream, the stream wanted to occupy a width that was about 400 feet. And so that provides some indication of what the stream may want to do in this site that has been now plowed. Doesn't contain any of those topographic signals, but maybe that provides some indications of what you may want to do moving forward. Next slide. So what is the best method to use? Well, what we did just for out of sort of curiosity is we looked at a project and applied all of the different methods to see what we came up with. First, we looked at the shear stress. And so based upon this, we varied the shear stresses, not knowing that there was some uncertainty in vegetation, and we found that maybe you need roughly 110 to 170 feet. Then we did an estimation based upon the empirical equations, and we did it a couple of ways. One, we used what seems like it's been used a bit in the Front Ranges, these regional curves. Just using this method, we were getting areas or widths that were about 50 to about 90 feet. Then we did belt width just directly from empirical equations and flows, excluding, not using the regional curves, trying to factor in how the flows would change and how more flow that comes in during development would change the width that's needed. In that case, we're getting about 200 feet. Then we looked at the topography, and for this we used floodplains. We were getting a wide range because the floodplain varied between 100 and 400 feet. And then lastly, we used the reference area, and this was on the previous slide. From two different areas, we're getting somewhere between 400 and 430 feet. So you given all of that is like, well, what is the correct answer? And the big point of this is there is not a correct answer. And I think the second point you should take away from this is there's a lot of uncertainty, and I think you maybe fool yourself if you do one of these assessments and take that and call that good. So what we would recommend you do is, one, you understand the context and all of that you're trying to fit the stream management corridor in, but you probably would have the person that's doing the evaluation run through multiple of these, if not all of these, because it's relatively quickly. I think these calculations were all done in well under a day to come up with this. So yes, it takes time, but is a day or a couple of days early in the planning process, does that save you time later on when you figure out that things maybe don't fit in?
I think this table that you've got on the wall just really, I think, describes that continuum of risk that I was talking about, where you can almost use the belt widths that you've come up with as a delineation of the risk. When you go with, say, 49 feet, I hope in your mind you're going, gee, that has a lot of risk. And when you go with 430 feet, I hope you're going, that should be pretty conservative. And so you're really plotting a place on that continuum that's somewhere in between. Hopefully you're not picking the left extreme,
Yeah.
Being the smallest.
Great point. And I think that, and even in addition to that, if you would run through all of these and you'd see that 49, you maybe say, that's probably an outlier and it's maybe an unacceptable risk because it really doesn't match with the other things. And that gets to the point that I was saying is there's a lot of different equations and a lot of different ways a person could interpret the same equations. And so to me, this is one of the challenges is you could have someone, let's say, if someone was given the task of find the smallest stream management corridor, you could go through calculations and you could present that and say, see, it's 49. And as people that maybe are involved with reviewing design plans, maybe you'd say, what else did you look at? How else can you back this up? Because that just seems a little bit small on a major stream.
Yeah.
In
And I
fact, it'd
was,
be reasonable for them to ask for, give me a range rather than just tell me what the smallest is.
in the analogy I always give this to for, sorry, everyone else, for the engineers in the room is we all know that engineering and especially hydrology and hydraulics is not an exact science. And I always use rock sizing as an example to what Troy is talking about here. All the engineers in the room, you know that when you're sizing rock, you're using, yes, you might have a mild slope, but you're using mild, you're using steep, and you're using flat slope equations. And you're drawing from multiple lines of evidence to come up with your range. And like you said, there's ranges and there's risks associated with that. And there is a lot of judgment that's being exercised in that. This is very similar to that. No one would size rock with just one equation.
There's been a quick request to hop back to slide 66. Rich, I'm not sure if there's a question you had or if you just wanted to look at the slide. Okay.
All right. Okay, perfect.
We are-
And just a heads up to
Time.
all of you, you do have PDF of the slides. If you're late in joining or checking your email, the slides are in your inbox as well. Feel free to keep us going, Troy.
Ryan, is this back to you?
Yeah, so I can talk a little bit about this slide and Mary can jump in. I think she's got some thoughts here, but this is a project that I come back to a lot. This is Little Dry Creek in the city of Westminster, up near about 67th and Federal. And this is the photo on the right is just a perfect example of merging the development goals, the transportation goals with the design of the channel itself. And then in this project specifically, we even had to do a regional detention facility because it's at sort of the lower end within the overall watershed within the basin. And so I love sharing this photo on the right just because it shows how much you can actually pack into a somewhat confined area, if you strategically plan ahead of time. And this project started, 12 years ago, and it went on for probably 8 years before we even got to a final construction package. So there was a lot of time spent working with the city, RTD, unincorporated Adams County, which is to the south of this project. And so everybody was at the table, and I think it's just a perfect example of how all of that came together really well.
And I know I insert the next one on your behalf, Troy. I know that you looked at this corridor from a stream corridor standpoint. I just wanted to see if there was anything worth highlighting from looking at the native condition to really this natural condition that we're trying to mimic.
I think you're talking the next slide.
Yes, Cherry Creek, I'm sorry.
Yeah, this I think is a really good slide because it talks to the balance. If you would run through and do calculations on this, one of the things you look at is historic areas. And you would say Cherry Creek needs to be a mile wide. And that's what the information would tell you. That is in its natural setting. And so, obviously that's not what we did, but the project was able to capture back more land than the corridor was occupying, significantly more land than the corridor was occupying before the project. Within that, there's this calculations that were done to come up with a channel and width of the channel that was appropriate for a very much impacted hydrograph. So the flows are significantly altered by the reservoir. The sediment load is altered by the reservoir. With that, we use these same calculations to come up with the channel size, and then you do what you can. And I think it creates a really nice space that certainly doesn't have all the room that you ideally have in the stream corridor for something like Cherry Creek, but it does a good job of working within the constraints that just are reality.
Oh. So I've got just a slide here to follow up with what Troy has said several times during his part of the presentation is that the discussion of the street, although I think you've circled back to this as well, but that the other elements of the 5 elements that haven't been touched on much include those community values and the vegetation piece of the considerations. And so I've just put up a couple of bullets here that again go into the thinking of how wide does that corridor need to be. And I do think we've touched upon it a little bit, but those are just some other considerations, you know, and again, it's the equalizer. You gotta go up and down depending on the context. Again, a lot of these things that we're talking about, and I think this has shown up in the comments a little bit, is don't get too focused in on the whole natural piece of it. Because again, we have to use these same concepts when we're in a very confined space. And so the right solution is always going to be context driven. The right solution and the highest functioning, lowest maintenance solution, sometimes, depending on the context, is going to be a fairly hardened product. And that's just the way it has to be. But even if we're just trying to maximize the functionality of those types of projects, I think we're a step ahead of where we used to be. So just want to make that point. And that's all I've got on that. Darn those 5 elements. There they are again. Okay, next.
Just trying to hammer it home.
Hammer it home.
Hit over the head here.
And I will just say, again, we're not saying planner become an engineer, engineer become a planner, engineer become a geomorphologist, engineer become an ecologist. Don't you all go and sign up for some of these classes. That's not what we're saying here. What we really are saying is that your discipline on your teams need to represent these 5 elements. This is kind of foundational to having an effective project that is, in my opinion, also cost efficient. Final stretch home, Ryan.
Yeah, and so the next round of slides here, I'm not going to go through each one of them in depth because there's a lot of text coming up. But what I wanted to do was really just kind of highlight the main points we're talking about, and then since we're sharing these slides with you now, you know, you'll have sort of this summary section of the webinar and the PDF to come back to. And so, you know, when we're talking about planning, Brent gave, you know, a great section on the planning process, but planning for space, you know, again, utilizing the existing corridors that you have. Again, with this photo of Little Dry Creek, this was a case where we actually had to move the stream. It was to the far right of that photo, and it was actually impacting the private properties, where some of those private properties didn't have a backyard because it was so eroded and so close to their house. And so we had to actually recreate that stream corridor. But if you can, you know, preserve the best that you have, use that distributed detention, and spread out your flows throughout the site. You know, on this project, we had multiple, we called them forebays, but they were kind of informal infiltration areas where we just allowed the water to go into that space to infiltrate, get out trash and debris and things like that, and then go discharge into the stream network. Using the space, you know, for multiple functions, for park space, for recreation, regional trail space, things like that. And then, you know, focusing on that holistic approach. So planning for flexibility, you know, as Bren mentioned, there's always going to be competing priorities, you know, whether it's land use density, roadway, if there's conflicts with parks and rec amenities or other municipal groups, easements that have already been set in place from, you know, water or sanitary easements. And so with the flexibility, the intent is really just sort of trying to prioritize what's going to provide that maximum benefit to the community and to the goals of the development, whether it's a greenfield site or redevelopment in an urban setting. And then just, you know, understanding, as much as we would like to preserve all the natural drainage ways throughout a site, we know that's not possible. So there has to be flexibility with that as well. Planning for cost. So the 2 photos on the right are from the Backcountry neighborhood, which is in Highlands Ranch. And this is a great development that I believe this was, I didn't work on this one, but I believe this was another case where the developer actually took this on at the very beginning of the planning process to really figure out how to use the topography on site. And so the photos are showing, rather than having curb and gutter and storm sewer and, you know, putting everything in a pipe or buried underground, utilizing the topography to create these open channels throughout the development where stormwater or runoff would go from the street into these natural facilities, as opposed to just being put into a pipe and buried. And as you can see, it helps to create that passive open space. So now you can apply, you can put in trails and things like that within the space that you know, provide multiple benefits again. And infiltration is the big one here. You know, when we're talking about reducing runoff and distributing the load of runoff throughout the site, you know, infiltration is one of the biggest ways to promote water quality and reduce those peak flows.
And just to clarify, it's not Mueller sponsoring the event. It's actually Ryan Taylor.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yes. I get to choose the photos for my slides, so. And then this really just goes back to what Bao was talking about earlier with that 50 times flow versus, you know, when you're looking at sort of a developed condition with no detention on site, you know, versus developing that site, but then providing more of a distributed detention approach and reducing those peak flows. You know, within the stream corridor itself, it helps to, you know, potentially you can reduce some of those structural elements that's needed, you know, within the channel corridor that Troy talked about. And then this is an example of, you know, again, planning for cost is when you start looking at sort of, you know, what you could call the traditional approach of a single detention facility that I've kind of highlighted in red there at the confluence of all these drainage ways, what the stream improvement impacts from a cost standpoint are. You can see that, you know, that traditional approach in blue actually ends up being much more costly than taking this more of a planning approach ahead to where, you know, from a detention standpoint, yes, you have 10 more detention facilities. However, those are much smaller facilities. They have smaller structures. They require less maintenance because you're not loading an entire single facility with all the trash and debris from the entire site. From a stream improvement standpoint, cost per linear foot goes down because you're not having to integrate all of the rock, bank stabilization, drop structures, all of those things. And then, you know, when you combine those together, you know, you can see a pretty significant benefit when you take this approach, planning for cost. And then the last slide just shows what that development looks like now in 2024 with the pink areas highlighting those distributed detention facilities.
And I just want to say, this is a project that is actually being constructed right now.
Mhm.
I also want to give credit to them. It took a multidisciplinary team to make this work out. This is not about the flood district. This is about a holistic team. It took the land planner, it took the developer, it took the town, it took the dirt contractor for the developer, it took our contractor, it took our planner and our stormwater engineers to work together to make this work, because it's a very integrated approach to kind of land planning. So it did take that team. I just want to give credit to the rest of the team that's not represented on this panel because they were very key to the success of this.
Yeah. Yep. So just wanted to kind of end with, you know, the proof as Bao mentioned, I think this morning or yesterday, of how taking this approach and really integrating the entire team in this planning process, you know, you actually see the benefits.
And I would say that it's not perfect, just for full transparency. We are learning from it, but every project that we are working on, we're learning and trying to make things kind of better moving forward. Before I open this up to maybe one question, or maybe we're out of time. I do just want to acknowledge that these webinars are going to be a staple for us at the Flood District, and we love for each one to be impactful to you. And so Laura Hines has put in the chat a link to the survey. It is also in an email to you from Lindsay Franklin. If you wouldn't mind, before you step away for lunch, it just takes 5 minutes. Give us your feedback, because we want to make sure that these are effective and engaging. And with that, Laura, do we have time?
We had a few comments in the chat, but I think we're pretty wrapped up.
Okay. Well, if there's any questions that we will surface, and if there's anything that we want to circle back to, we will. But thank you so much for giving us really 4 hours of your day over the last couple of days. It's been enjoyable for us, so we hope the same of you. And we expect this is going to be an annual event, if not more than once a year. So thank you, team. Yes, you guys are going to be back.
Semi-annual.
Somewhat annual.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.